Um, okay, so I want to talk about the sources, the kinds of sources that Quinones uses. And I'm sure you will have noticed already, he uses lots, not just lots of sources, but lots of different types of sources. And I think this makes for some of the fun of the book, the interest that it has for us. But it can also be a little bit disorienting when you're going, you might be reading a section of a medical study about addiction, and then in the next chapter, you're in Mexico in a small village. But I think it's a really important aspect of the book that I wanted to think about a little bit with you. Okay, so Quinones' use of different kinds of sources gives his narrative an especially rich sense of reality that helps us appreciate the complexity of the problem he's addressing, right? And I know for me, a lot of the sections dealing with characters like Enrique, for instance, really kind of humanize the issue. There's also the prison guard who gets addicted to opiates. And he explains that he was injured and got addicted to opiates while he actually had a legitimate reason to be taking them. And while these may not, you might call this anecdotal evidence, right? That may not have the kind of scientific heft of something like a large study conducted by the government or by a hospital system or something. But what it does is it helps kind of keep the reader engaged. Okay. And so broadly speaking, we can break down sources into two main types. There's quantitative research, and there's qualitative research. Okay. And as you think about your own research projects you're going to be doing in this kind of last chunk of the semester, I think it's really good to just kind of as you're researching sources, like ask yourself, am I over relying on one of these? Not to say that you can't, I mean, you can do a research project that's all qualitative or all quantitative, but you may find that your argument is more compelling if you give your reader a little bit of both. Um, it can certainly be weighted more toward one than the other, but it can be really useful. And even just for your own understanding of the problem, a lot of times, if you're doing like heavy statistical research, it can really be eye-opening to go speak to someone who has dealt with the issue that you're investigating, right? And then on the flip side, if you're relying on qualitative research like interviews, sometimes you can be missing really key elements of the problem that will be revealed to you by a little bit of statistical research. So when we're talking about quantitative research, in Quinones, the way it shows up is he looks at prescription data, like how often are doctors prescribing these drugs, overdose and mortality statistics, how often are people dying or being seriously injured by these drugs, public health data, law enforcement data, like numbers of arrests, things like that, economic and demographic data. So this would be like, what's the unemployment rate? Demographic data might be people moving out of a town or moving into a town. And then sales figures. This is primarily from the pharmaceutical industry, but he also talks about sales figures for the drug dealers themselves. And then qualitative um, research would be, we might think of this as quantitative as more objective and qualitative as more subjective, right? So in subjective research, you're getting people's points of view, right? So you get that through interviews, personal testimonies, case studies, things like diary entries, um, media reports, interviews, etc. Okay. Now, to complicate things just a little bit more, there's nothing saying that one source has to be one or the other, qualitative or quantitative, right? A lot of sources are just going to be both. So if you look at a source that you're researching and you initially can't figure out, is this more quantitative or more qualitative? Just remind yourself it could be what's called a mixed methods source. Okay, so these combine qualitative information with quantitative information, and I think that when this is done well, the approach makes an argument both emotionally compelling and analytically persuasive, right? So the kind of human perspective that we get through qualitative sources or source material helps us relate to the story. It might kind of provoke some kind of pathos response. We might kind of feel sympathetic toward the person. Alternately, we might feel frustrated with them, but it's going to kind of get us engaged. However, that can be still unconvincing if there's no objective data behind it, right? So, I think Quinones uses statistics and data to really convince us that this is a very widespread problem. And I can tell you, as someone who kind of lived through this as an adult, you would hear little things about fentanyl and opiate addiction and things like that, but it didn't, at least for me, it took about a decade for that to really resolve into something that looked like a major national crisis. And so one of the things, and actually, I think Quinones' book is really instrumental in bringing this to the attention of the broader public. And if the data was not as severe as he shows it to be, I think people wouldn't care about it as much. So some examples of mixed method sources would be Drug Enforcement Agency and public health reports, right? So those if you think about like an arrest that's being made by a DEA agent, they might find a certain amount of drugs, and that would be written down in an objective fashion. But then they might interview the arrestee and find out, what were you up to carrying this amount of drugs? And so you'd get a kind of combination of the two styles of research there. Congressional testimony, where someone's testifying before Congress and they're maybe giving their perspective as a community leader, but they're going to themselves be trying to buttress that with their own data so that they can be more convincing to the congressional panel. Lawsuits and hospital records would be two more examples of sources that combine qualitative and quantitative research. Okay, now I thought this was kind of interesting because once you start paying attention, and actually, I think this is useful in thinking about your own research projects because sometimes people get intimidated by this project and feel like it's like a lot to bite off, or a lot to chew. I'm kind of mixing my metaphors there, but um, what tends to happen is when I'm really deeply invested in a project, I just start to see stuff in my day-to-day life that relates to it, and I find that sort of fortuitously, like information just starts to come to me. And before I sat down to record this lecture, I subscribed to a kind of a funky little quarterly newspaper called County Highway. It's not doesn't have a lot of distribution, but it's kind of interesting. And there was this article here, Delray Beach, America's rehab capital. And I thought it was interesting because you finish Dreamland and you put it down and you might kind of think, well, that in some sense that problem's behind me. And then you pick up a newspaper and there it is again. And um, there's a point that this writer makes here that I thought was really interesting. So he says here, in the broader sense, is Delray Beach, a small city in South Florida on the peninsula's east side. It lies 50 miles north of Miami in Palm Beach County, and it is sometimes called the rehab capital of America. Other times, it is called the relapse capital of America. The nicknames owe to the town's dizzyingly high number of detox and sober living facilities. At one point, there were some 700 halfway houses in the city of 66,000, and more drug treatment centers than elementary schools in the greater region. There is, to my knowledge, no singularly satisfying way to account for this state of affairs. We can first point to origins. In the late 60s, a policeman, pharmacist, and surgeon established the Drug Abuse Foundation to support addicts and their families. Similar organizations soon formed and followed suit. Okay, now the line that stood out to me in this section of the article was what I put in bold here. There's no singularly satisfying way to account for this state of affairs. So this is the problem that Quinones is facing when he sits down to write this book, right? That the more he researches, um, he describes actually in the interview that I posted on Canvas, Quinones talks about like the early days of his research, and how for a period of times things got kind of more confusing to him rather than clearer to him, right? Because all of these different possible vectors of influence on the problem kept cropping up, right? And this author is noticing the same thing, that it seems like it's really hard to put your finger on the cause of this problem. And as I think Quinones shows us in Dreamland, that's because there isn't just one cause, okay? And so this brings us to the question, well, how do we even start to understand a problem with multiple causes, okay? And I thought one way to approach this question was to think about what were some prior explanations for the drug crisis. Okay, so when I was a kid, there was a famous kind of public service announcement by Nancy Reagan, the First Lady of the United States, wife of Ronald Reagan. She had this famous campaign called "Just Say No," and so for her, the solution to drug addiction and drug abuse was just say no. Like if you just don't start using, you won't get addicted. Um, when I was in elementary school, they had the DARE program where they would bring a police officer into elementary schools and sort of tell you about the dangers of drug use. Ironically, there was research published decades later that showed that students that were exposed to the DARE program actually had higher incidence of drug use. Um, so, these two explanations, like the first one is just a matter of kind of willpower and having a moral compass. And then the second one maybe being something like kids being scared straight, was a term used to hear. Um, these did not really seem adequate to kind of explain or deal with the drug problem. And then I was thinking about like, what about pop culture? What kinds of things do we see as explanations for this crisis in film and literature, or just even on the news? And the first thing that came to mind was what I'm going to call the great man theory of history, right? And this is kind of a passe way of doing history, but this is a theory that says that, big historical movements are driven by powerful, charismatic leaders, right? So a Napoleon Bonaparte, at the end of the French Revolution, kind of grabs the reins of power and goes on the march and invades Russia, kind of turns the wheels of history through the pure force of one individual's will. Okay. And I think that actually the drug crisis was sort of viewed through this lens in a lot of ways. So we have here Chapo Guzman, the kind of head of the Sinaloa cartel. A lot of the media that you would see about drugs, I mean, even now, it centers on these drug kingpins, powerful actors that are kind of working behind the scenes. Another thing this reminded me of was The Godfather. This is a great novel, by the way, by Mario Puzo. The film was based on this. It's a real page turner, but I like the cover again. Like you've got, someone kind of holding the puppet strings, controlling the marionette, and this kind of suggests something similar that, the Godfather, who's a mafia boss, um, is this very charismatic, powerful guy, kind of scary, and he just always seems to be one step ahead of everyone else in the system. And this is an attractive way of explaining problems because it kind of locates the guilt or the culpability in one person. And it also suggests that if you could defeat that one person, then you would solve the problem, right? And I think Quinones is suggesting that this is a far too simplistic way of viewing a social problem like drug addiction, drug abuse, and the violence that gets associated with that. Okay. Okay, so then if it's not just one person controlling things from behind the scenes, what is it? Well, he gives us a bunch of places to look. I've just written down a handful here. But Quinones' argument seems to be that this is a systemic problem, right? So this is challenging for, say, law enforcement because if you arrest one person, someone else shows up the next week in the same spot selling drugs, right? So you actually have to kind of think on a systems level. And so what are these systems? Well, one of them is big business. So he talks a lot about Arthur Sackler, who kind of invents pharmaceutical advertising. He innovates the pharmaceutical ad and also the system of sending pharmaceutical sales reps in person to doctors' offices to try to kind of encourage and incentivize doctors to prescribe more drugs. Um, there's a great moment here on page 127. It says, as Arthur Sackler had done with Valium in the 1960s, Purdue, another pharmaceutical company, set about promoting OxyContin as virtually risk-free and a solution to the problems patients present to doctors with every day. The company urged salespeople, meanwhile, to attach an emotional aspect to non-cancer pain so physicians treat it more seriously and aggressively. So here, Quinones is showing that it wasn't just that you sent out this army of salespeople to sell doctors on prescribing the drugs. It was the way they did it, right? They were appealing to doctors' sense of empathy. Um, they were suggesting that we should have a kind of merciful attitude toward people in pain, and they were successful in changing the way we thought about pain. Um, Now, there's another moment on the previous page, 126, that's kind of related. And there's this problem that there's a revolving door between the private pharmaceutical industry and the government entities that are supposed to be regulating them. In this case, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So he says he's talking about Dr. Curtis Wright, who was an FDA examiner. And, so he's tasked with trying to control how much these drugs are being prescribed. And at the end of this paragraph in the middle of the page, it says, Wright later left the FDA to work for Purdue Pharma. Okay, so if you think about a government regulator who's sort of the watchdog on this industry, but he knows that when he leaves the government, if he has played nice with big pharma, they will offer him a job that is very well compensated, right? That sets up a bad incentive structure where the government regulators are going to be kind of tempted to not really regulate the industry that strenuously. Okay. Um, Family doctors also have a kind of out of whack incentive structure. Essentially, they make more money when they prescribe more drugs to more people. And I think Quinones does a great job. You might think like, well, didn't they take the Hippocratic Oath? Don't doctors care about the health of their patients? And I think he shows how, individuals are all complicated. We're all under different pressures. And because of the onslaught of advertising, um, prescribing these drugs became normalized, and doctors may not have even been aware of the full extent of how much they had increased their rate of prescribing drugs like OxyContin. Okay. Um, Now, the third one here, pain is the fifth vital sign. Thought this was fascinating. I wasn't really aware of this, that um, until the last few decades, vital signs would be things like your heart rate, right? They're objectively measurable physiological um, phenomenon. But the medical establishment added a quote unquote fifth vital sign, which was the patient's subjective description of their pain level. So you'll know if you've ever been in a hospital with an injury or a severe illness, they'll ask you what your pain level is 1 to 10, and they'll keep track of that, right? And the idea is that although it's a subjective measure, the person who comes in saying they have a sprained ankle that is a level 2 of pain, if suddenly they're telling you that they're at a number 9, it's kind of, makes sense that they're probably in quite a bit more pain. And Quinones shows, though, how patients kind of learn to game this system and just inflate their pain levels in order to get more prescriptions from doctors. Okay. Um, Another I thought really fascinating element that Quinones looks at is this phenomenon of suburban isolation. And this is especially tough in communities where there's been deindustrialization, job losses, high unemployment. There was a really famous book called Bowling Alone by Richard Florida, a sociologist, who talked about the kind of degradation of community activities that sort of took hold, especially in the 90s. Whereas people maybe used to belong to a local bowling league, or they would meet up with their friends to do any number of activities, right? That because of the suburbanization of the U.S. population and also the rise of technology, right? It used to be prior to Netflix and cell phones, you kind of had to go out to be entertained. Um, Unless you just wanted to watch what was on TV that night or read a book. But if you wanted to socialize, you kind of had to leave the house and go be in public and be in community with people. And Quinones really kind of takes note that this sort of change in our community structure made people more vulnerable to drug abuse. And I thought that was really interesting. Okay, number five, entrepreneurial heroin dealers from Jalisco. Now you might notice in his discussions of the Jalisco boys, there's a kind of a grudging respect that he pays to these guys. They're very innovative. Um, One of the things they do is they don't go to major cities like New York, where penalties tend to be stiffer. They're looking for these second and third tier cities with less police presence. They also don't carry guns and they don't sell large amounts of drugs. So they're very smart. They're kind of minimizing their legal exposure, and it was just a kind of a new business model that was very successful. Okay. Um, he talks about consumer culture. Now, this actually really comes out in all of the discussion of Levi's 501 jeans that are really big with the Mexican communities that are discussed in the book. Um, but he kind of zooms out from something specific like wanting a new pair of Levi's to the kind of culture of instant gratification at large that took hold of the United States in the kind of post World War II era, but especially like 1980s, 90s, and into the early aughts, as advertising became more and more sophisticated. He talks about Edward Bernays, who used Freudian psychology to kind of tap into the way our minds work and the way we respond to advertorial images to great effect. Um, and then, of course, economic decline. Portsmouth, Ohio is in the Rust Belt. A lot of the places that he's going to are has kind of suffered economic downturns that I would say sort of started in the 70s, but really accelerated after the passage of NAFTA in, I believe, 1992. That's the North American Free Trade Agreement. So you had a lot of manufacturing jobs that went abroad. And then that phenomenon just continued apace in the intervening decades. And so a lot of these cities in the Rust Belt, once those jobs went away, they didn't really come back. Or these communities had trouble revitalizing themselves economically. Okay. And then Quinones also talks about patients themselves. And I thought this was interesting because, one, if we go back to the Nancy Reagan idea of just say no, right? There is this sort of line of thinking that says, like, okay, you can have all these sociological explanations for things or systemic explanations, but what about personal responsibility? If you just um, never put the crack pipe in your mouth, then you won't be a crack addict. And while I would say Quinones is mostly not very sympathetic to that argument, I think he's much more invested in these broad-based sociological and demographic arguments. He does balance it out by kind of zeroing in on moments where people do have choice. Some people do, through great struggle, get themselves out of their addictions and into kind of better modes of living. And so I thought that was a kind of an important balancing move that he makes. Okay. So there's a lot there. The project you're going to be working on will be much smaller in scope, but the reason I wanted to point out all of these different threads in Quinones's work is that when you sit down to research something, a lot of times you just go to Google Scholar or you go to something like JSTOR or you just go to the library and you start looking and you can end up in one track. And I would really encourage you like talk to some people, um, read the popular press, right? Read academic journal articles, look at some hard data, like really try to get more than just a couple of strands into your research. Doesn't mean you have to use all of them in your final written project. You may kind of decide to focus on two or three main sources, but it's really helpful in my experience to kind of, at least at the beginning of the research project, give yourself a kind of broad scope of material because it will influence the way you think about your project going forward. Okay. So we'll talk about these projects more in the coming weeks, and I hope you're enjoying Dreamland. I know it's a little on the long side, but keep plugging away. I promise it's very interesting. The latter half, especially, I find really compelling. So, um, if you have any questions about it or you're confused about any sections of it, I'd love to talk to you in office hours, or we can kind of take up the conversation in discussions. Okay. So I will sign off and see you next week.